I call the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Speaker, that was an interesting speech from that member who made quite a good contribution towards the end, because he ran down a whole series of potential pressure points and, if you will, futuristic hotspots in our region. I turned to a colleague and I said, isn't that actually if it's all right, I'm trying to praise you. I know this is difficult, nobody has in here, but give me a go. He actually made a valid point. I know this is a unique thing in Mr Hayes' existence. Wouldn't it be nice, wouldn't it be appropriate, therefore, given all the illustration of the potential threats that our region may face, that we had a viable defence force? Would not that be the case? And I was reflecting, sir, when I came into this place in 1999, and I made a speech along with others around the Defence Force, and I recall the same sorts of issues coming up, because if you look at the history of our country, bizarrely, even though Labor originally was the party made up at its original times of the odd conscientious objector and what would be called perhaps now peacenik or whatever, it has always been throughout our history Labor governments, not those who pontificate and the Conservatives on the other side, who have put resources into our military. I know that's sort of a strange concept for Mr Hayes to reflect on, but in 1999, for instance, when we came to government, I do recall speeches in this House about a defence force that we inherited. They served in Bosnia. M113s, the personnel carriers that were in Bosnia. The National Party had depleted the Defence Force budget so badly that we had the indignity of going to our allies, the Australians. I think Sir Les Patterson was still an MFAT at that time, and asking the Australians if we could borrow some armour plate to weld it onto the personnel carriers that could not keep up with the British trucks they were supposed to defend in Bosnia. And then, to cap it all off, Mr Hayes' party then had the indignity of cutting it off with the oxyacetylene torches to give it back to the Australians.
Point of order, the Honourable Member John Hayes.
Mr Speaker, could you please clarify with the Speaker whether Mr Hayes and Sir Les Patterson are the same person?
No. That is not a point of order. That is misusing the point of order to score a political point.
I'm sorry. If it's the same person, I'm going to lay a complaint against them and ask them to withdraw.
I call the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Thank you, sir. I'd invite Mr Hayes perhaps to watch a wee bit of contemporary television. He can draw his own conclusions. The other person I was thinking in my mind is Captain Mannering, but that was a different show. The point is, and Mr Hayes, of course, doesn't like it. He likes to dish it out. But when the old feet are put to the fire, he doesn't like it. The thing that Mr Hayes has to realise about the history of his party, as I was saying, sir, we had to borrow the armour plate from the Aussies, weld it on, the personnel carriers couldn't keep up with the British trucks, and then we had to cut the armour plate off and give it back to them. We inherited a defence force whose radios were not interoperable. We inherited a navy where those geniuses in Mr Hayes' party, remember the Charles Upper? The ship, I mean, not to be confused with the great man, in case Mr Hayes is having a bit of a mind block. That was a great disaster from the National Party, who bought a ship that ended up with the great man's name, whose body resides in Papua Nui at the Papua Nui RSA. That ship was carrying oranges, or lemons, or both, around Spain. That's the history of a National Party that every time it comes into government talks tough about the Defence Force, how patriotic, how they stand by them, sir. And in this bill, you have a deficiency in capability, and it's a National Party that comes in and makes the cuts. And Mr Hayes made an interesting point. He used the old slogan, we're going to get rid of all these back office flunkies, and we're going to, promote the front line, bolster up the front line. Well, here's Mr Hayes' problem. That of the 495 people made redundant last year, as my colleague Mr Goff said, 295 were uniformed staff, soldiers, and Mr Hayes, not one person was cut from the back office, the front office, the basement or the attic of Ministry of Defence headquarters. Not one. Not one of these so-called pen pushers, these sort of back office people that Mr Hayes talks about. So as usual, this is a sort of bill that talks about capability, talks about efficiency, talks about some lofty goals, but when the rubber hits the road, and governments of course, send men and women out into harm's way. It is governments. And very rarely do we in this House get in harm's way, although judging by Mr Hayes' demeanour. I think he may have been in harm's way quite recently. But governments send men and women in our Defence Force into conflict zones. And what those men and women ask is two things: that the cause is honourable, and secondly, that governments who send them into harm's way give them, the men and women, the equipment and the resources that they need to protect themselves, to protect their comrades, and to defend our country. And I remember with other colleagues in 1999 making a very similar speech like this after we inherited a national government cuts, slash and burn as they underfunded and cut the military. And I just invite Mr Hayes, he might want to, take another call. His minister might want to get up and maybe make a contribution or have another speaker do it. I invite them to look at the redundancy pattern, because not one person, the so-called alleged pen pushers from head office in the MOD, have been made redundant. It's been frontline capability. And as for the territorial force, I know, as every member of this parliament will know, the greater difficulty that it is now for employers to put resources aside to allow their staff to engage in territorial duties. And I pay tribute to the armed forces who have put a hell of a lot of effort in the last number of years in promoting the territorial forces, working with employers, explaining to employers the wonderful skills that those men and women, if they're exposed to territorial engagement, will bring back to businesses and to the entities and the workplaces where they work. Well, now, of course, that's all up for grabs. And I noticed that the sort of balloon across the way has popped and gone silent. So I invite Mr Hayes, who does have some experience, I believe, in foreign affairs matters when he was a diplomat, as he outlined the potential and futuristic threats that our region may have, I'd invite him to illustrate for us where these cuts are going to be extended to. Because the National Party, of course, uses the term savings. They say it's savings. Now that sounds, savings, that sounds quite a positive term, doesn't it? What savings actually mean is when you take resource from one part of an entity and redeploy it within that entity in another part. In this case, they're taking resource directly out of the frontline staff, the soldiers, those who they will send over to the conflict zones in the future to protect this country and to protect this country's interests. So I invite Mr Hayes to reflect on that, and I invite him to reflect on how he is going to get the $400 million cut, and let's call it what it is. It's not a saving. The $400 million cut by 2015, and at the same time sustain morale such that it is, given the lowest morale rating in the Defence Force survey, as Mr Goff said, since its inception. It will go lower, given that these resources are taken away. And then the question is, how are we going to encourage other New Zealanders, younger New Zealanders, people who are thinking of making a commitment to the Defence Force in the future, who may be thinking today, especially given we have extremely high unemployment, but even putting that aside, that they want to make a contribution to the Defence Force, that they may want to sign up, put the uniform on, do the training, and go out and protect our country and serve our country. Well, if I was a young person looking at this, I'd be scratching my head and going, there ain't no future here, when the resources are being stripped away by that minister, Mr Hayes, and this government, that of course talks in some sort of nationalistic, patriotic way about supporting our defence forces and what they're going to do to create efficiencies. But we know the real rubber that hits the road that is masked by this bill are the savage cuts that every time the National Party get in, they make in our Defence Force. Every time. Look at the history. Look at the history. 1990 to 99. They did it, they cut it, they cut to the bone the Defence Force. Now they're back in again, and history is repeating itself as it has throughout the period every time a national government has been in here. It was a Labor government, sir, that increased the capability of the Defence Force, and yes, we made hard decisions, and yes, we made some controversial decisions which some didn't agree with. But by God, sir, we put resource into the Navy, we put resource into the Air Force, we put resource into the Territorial Force, and we put resource into the regular force. We didn't come into Parliament waving around a bill saying how great thou art, at the same time as we were slashing and burning defence personnel capability, at the same time as we were asking men and women to go and serve their country and put themselves in harm's way. So I say to Mr Hayes, he's following a fine but tragic National Party tradition of slashing and burning the Defence Force, and I invite him to examine very, very closely where those cuts are coming from, what their frequency is, how they'll be achieved, and how they'll be achieved in the future. And I look forward to him celebrating the cuts in MOD headquarters when he makes them.
I call the Honourable Member Kennedy Graham.